Have you ever noticed something strange? Right before something good happens, you suddenly start getting in your own way. An important exam is coming, but somehow you're watching videos instead. A big opportunity appears, and suddenly you lose motivation. A relationship starts getting serious, and for reasons you can't explain, you begin pulling away. The strange part is that you often know exactly what you're doing. You know you're procrastinating, you know you're avoiding, you know you're making things harder than they need to be, and yet you keep doing it anyway. Why? Most people think the answer is simple. They call it laziness, lack of discipline, lack of motivation. But what if none of those explanations are true? What if the real reason is much deeper? What if you're not afraid of failure at all? What if you're afraid of what happens after success? Because success creates a challenge that failure never does. Failure allows you to stay exactly who you are. Success forces you to become someone new, and your brain isn't always comfortable with that. The truth is, some of the biggest obstacles in your life may not be standing in front of you. They may be hiding inside you. And once you understand why, you'll never look at self-sabotage the same way again. Most people spend their lives believing they are afraid of failure. But failure isn't always the thing holding us back. Sometimes the real fear is success. That sounds strange at first. After all, who would be afraid of getting what they want? But think about what success actually does. Success changes expectations. It changes responsibilities. It changes the way other people see you. And sometimes it changes the way you see yourself. Imagine someone who has spent years thinking of themselves as the underdog, the person who struggles, the person who never quite measures up. Now imagine that person suddenly becoming successful. Something unexpected happens. The old story no longer fits. The identity they've carried for years starts falling apart. And for the brain, that can feel deeply uncomfortable. Because your brain loves certainty. It loves knowing who you are, even if that version of you isn't making you happy. Success doesn't just give you new opportunities. It asks you to become a new person. And that's where many people begin pulling back. Not because they don't want success, but because they don't yet recognize the person success requires them to become. But if success creates so much discomfort, why do people often choose painful situations they already know will hurt them? The answer reveals one of the strangest rules of human psychology. And once you see it, you'll start noticing it everywhere. One of the strangest truths about the human mind is this: your brain does not prioritize happiness. It prioritizes familiarity. Think about that for a moment. Not happiness, not growth, not fulfillment, familiarity. The brain would often rather choose a familiar pain than an unfamiliar possibility. That's why people stay in jobs they hate, why they remain in relationships that drain them, why they repeat habits they promised themselves they would leave behind. From the outside, these choices seem irrational, but from the brain's perspective, they make perfect sense. Because predictable pain feels safer than unpredictable change. Imagine spending years believing you're not good enough, years of self-doubt, years of procrastination, years of holding yourself back. Eventually, those patterns stop feeling unusual. They become familiar, and familiarity starts to feel like home, even when it's hurting you. This is why so many people return to the same emotional cycles again and again, not because they enjoy suffering, but because suffering they understand feels safer than a future they don't. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. What's one pattern you keep returning to, even though you know it hurts you? Maybe it's procrastination. Maybe it's self-doubt. Maybe it's a relationship you should have left behind long ago. Leave it in the comments. I'm curious how many of us are fighting the same battle. Because what if the real problem isn't the habit itself? What if the real problem is the story about yourself that keeps pulling you back to it? And that's exactly where we need to go next. If familiar pain isn't the real problem, then what is? The answer may be hiding in something most people never question, the story they tell themselves about who they are. Whether you realize it or not, you have a story. Everyone does. Maybe your story sounds like this: I'm not disciplined. I'm always behind. I'm not confident. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds. These stories often begin years before we're even aware of them. A few failures, a few embarrassing moments, a few painful experiences, And slowly, without realizing it, we start turning events into identity. A mistake becomes, I'm a failure. A rejection becomes, I'm not good enough. A difficult chapter becomes, this is who I am. The problem is that your brain loves consistency. Once it accepts a story, it starts looking for evidence that proves the story is true, and it ignores evidence that challenges it. But eventually something unexpected happens. Reality begins sending a different message. You get the promotion, you receive the compliment, you achieve something you didn't think was possible. Someone believes in you, someone sees potential in you, and suddenly a conflict appears, not between you and the world, but between two versions of yourself. The old identity says, I'm not good enough. Reality says, maybe you are. The old identity says, I don't belong here. Reality says, maybe you do. And for many people, that conflict feels incredibly uncomfortable, because if the old story is wrong, then who are you? This is where self-sabotage often begins, not because you're trying to fail, but because part of you is trying to protect an identity that feels familiar. Imagine receiving a compliment and immediately wanting to reject it. Imagine achieving something important and feeling like a fraud. Imagine being offered an opportunity and convincing yourself you're not ready. Have you ever experienced that? Have you ever received a compliment and immediately felt uncomfortable, as if you didn't deserve it? If that's happened to you, comment me, because what you're about to learn next may explain why. The truth is, your brain would rather preserve a familiar identity than risk stepping into an unfamiliar one, even when that unfamiliar identity is better, even when it's healthier, even when it's exactly what you've always wanted. And that's why people don't only sabotage their failures. Sometimes they sabotage their success. But self-sabotage doesn't always look the same. In fact, it usually hides behind behaviors that seem completely normal. And once you learn to recognize them, you'll start seeing them everywhere. When most people hear the phrase self-sabotage, they immediately think of procrastination. But procrastination is only one form of it. Self-sabotage often hides behind behaviors that seem completely normal. The first form is avoidance. You know it needs to be done, but you keep delaying it. Not because you don't care, but because part of you wants to avoid the discomfort that comes with action. The second form is perfectionism. This one is harder to recognize because it often looks productive. You keep planning, keep preparing, keep improving, waiting for the perfect moment to begin. But perfectionism is often fear disguised as preparation. The third form is self-doubt. You achieve something, receive a compliment, make progress, yet somehow it never feels enough. You continue questioning yourself even when the evidence says otherwise. The fourth form is withdrawal. You pull away from opportunities, from challenges, sometimes even from people who care about you, not because you don't want success, but because getting closer to it makes you feel exposed. On the surface, these four behaviors look very different. But underneath, they're all serving the same purpose, protecting an identity that feels familiar. And that leads to an important question. If these behaviors are trying to protect you, what exactly are they protecting you from? To answer that, we need to look inside the brain itself. At this point, it might seem like self-sabotage is purely psychological, a mindset problem, a confidence problem, a willpower problem. But the reality is much deeper than that, because when your identity feels threatened, your brain reacts as if you're facing real danger. Deep inside the brain is a structure called the amygdala. Think of it as your internal alarm system. Its job is simple: to constantly ask one question: am I safe? Thousands of years ago, this system helped our ancestors survive predators, harsh environments, and physical threats. Today, the threats have changed, but the alarm system remains the same. The modern brain doesn't only react to physical danger, it also reacts to psychological danger, rejection, failure, embarrassment, and even success. Because if success challenges your identity, the brain may interpret that change as a threat. The moment that happens, the alarm begins to sound. And once the alarm is active, your brain shifts into survival mode. Some people fight, they become defensive, they try to prove themselves. Others flee, they procrastinate, avoid, disappear into distractions. And then there's the response most people rarely talk about: freeze. You sit down to begin, You know exactly what needs to be done, you want to do it, but somehow nothing happens. You stare at the screen, stare at the notebook, stare at the opportunity in front of you, and your body refuses to move. If you've ever experienced that, comment freeze. I want to see how many people have felt this before, because it's far more common than most people realize. And once you understand what's really happening, you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is my brain trying to protect me from?" And that question changes everything, because it reveals why logic alone is almost never enough to break the cycle. This is where many people become frustrated, because they already know what they should do. They know they should start the project, make the phone call, apply for the opportunity, and yet they don't, so they assume the problem is discipline. But here's what most people don't realize. Your brain is emotional first, logical second. Long before your rational mind gets involved, your emotional brain has already reacted. Logic often arrives afterward, not to make the decision, but to explain it. This is why self-sabotage feels so confusing. Part of you wants to move forward, part of you wants to stay safe. And when those two forces collide, safety usually wins. Not because you're weak, not because you're lazy, but because survival systems are older and stronger than conscious thought. The good news is that once you understand this, you stop fighting yourself and start working with your brain instead of against it. Which brings us to the most important question of all. If this pattern was learned, can it be unlearned? The good news is that self-sabotage is not your identity, it's a pattern, and patterns can change. The first step is awareness. You can't change a pattern you can't see. Start paying attention to the moments when you pull back, when you procrastinate, when you doubt yourself, when you find a reason not to act, not to judge yourself, just to notice. The second step is taking smaller actions than your brain expects. Most people try to change their lives overnight, but lasting change rarely happens that way. Instead of focusing on the entire mountain, focus on the next step. One page, one email, one conversation, one small action is often enough to break the cycle. The third step is collecting new evidence. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, you give your brain new data. Data that challenges the old story. Data that proves you're capable of more than you thought. And eventually something begins to change. The old identity starts losing its grip. You stop asking, "Can I do this?" and start asking, "Who am I becoming?" Because real transformation isn't about achieving a goal. It's about becoming the kind of person who no longer needs to sabotage themselves. And once that shift happens, everything else starts to follow naturally. One day something strange will happen. You'll find yourself standing in front of an opportunity that once terrified you. The same challenge, the same uncertainty, the same possibility of failure. But this time, something will feel different. Not because the fear is gone, but because it no longer controls you. You'll realize that the biggest obstacle was never the opportunity itself. It was the version of you that believed you weren't ready for it. And little by little, you've started leaving that version behind. Before you go, I want to ask you one question. What is one version of yourself you're ready to leave behind? The procrastinator, the perfectionist, the people pleaser, the self-doubter? Let me know in the comments. Because the moment you stop protecting the identity that's holding you back, you create space for a new one to emerge. And that may be where real change begins.